Good evening. Welcome to the Bowden Church of Christ for our Sunday evening lesson. Thank you for tuning in tonight. Let's open up our Bibles to Proverbs chapter 3. Proverbs chapter 3 will be the text we're going to look at tonight as we continue our series on the book of Proverbs, looking at the wisdom that Solomon records that we can learn so much from today. Now, we're going to look at Proverbs chapter 3, verses 1 through 12, and I'm going to explain kind of the structure of these 12 verses. It's very important for our study, and then we're going to begin after that diving into the text. Many of you have probably been to funerals or have talked about people that have passed on from this life, and you've probably at some point either heard someone say or you've said this yourself, they had a good life. They had a good life. Now, you may think this of your own life. You may say, you know what, I've got a pretty good life. And I would say in general, all of us who live in this country and have the freedoms and the blessings that we have, especially all of us as Christians, we all have good lives. But in Proverbs chapter 3, Solomon writes to his son to tell him about how to live a good life. Or in other words, what we're going to call our lesson is keys to a good life. He gives him 6 specific things that his son needs to focus on, and they all pertain to wisdom, that give us a life that we would probably describe as good, a life that is enjoyable, and a life that we can really love. Now, again, remember that the book of Proverbs is really just what we would call the best case scenario. It is a book that is talking about the generalities of life, that if you act this way, most of the time this is what's going to happen. And so you need to keep that in mind in our study this evening, that what we're saying in Proverbs chapter 3 is not necessarily the rule, but it should be the intended outcome if we participate in these activities. Proverbs chapter 3, verses 1 through 12. Now, our lesson has 6 points in it. And so, as we read through these 12 verses, every 2 verses is going to make up 1 point. So, for instance, verses 1 and 2 make up point number 1. Verses 3 and 4 make up point number 2. Verses 5 and 6 make up point number 3, and so on through the rest of the verses in Proverbs chapter 3, verses 1 through 12. So, 12 verses, 6 points, 2 verses per point. And what Solomon is going to do in these verses is he's going to use one verse to propose an idea, right? This is what you should do in life. This is the way you should live. This is the attitude you should have. And then in the next verse he'll say, and here's the intended outcome. So in verse 1, we're going to study it in just a moment, but I'm just reading for your example. Proverbs chapter 3 and verse 1, he says, "My son, do not forget my teaching, but let your heart keep my commandments. For length of days and years of life and peace they will add to you." So the thing that he wants him to do in verse 1 is, don't forget my teaching, keep my commandments in your heart. Verse 2, the intended outcome is length of days, years of life, and peace they will add to you. So that's going to be the structure we follow through this lesson as we look at Proverbs 3, verses 1 through 12. And so today's lesson is going to focus on the benefits of wisdom that it can bring to my life in a daily setting. We specifically find here in Proverbs 3, 6 keys to living the good life. Now, I know that you understand, and I hope you understand as you're listening. If not, I want to reinforce this, that the New Testament tells us that we will suffer persecution. It was a reality for the people in the New Testament, and we understand that when we live a life as a Christian, the world is not going to always agree with everything we do. So when we speak of these principles in Proverbs chapter 3, understand that it's not painting for us an idealistic life that's never going to meet reality, or it's not, we would never actually live up to what we read here. What it's doing is presenting, if you live this way, this is the way that you should experience life in a general sense. And so remember, of course, that's how the book of Proverbs is written. It's all proverbial. It is intended outcomes. It's best case scenario, what should happen. And that's exactly what Proverbs chapter 3 teaches us. So let's dive in tonight, Proverbs chapter 3, how to live the good life. 6 keys. Let's look at key number 1 as we understand how to live a good life. The first principle is found in Proverbs chapter 3, verses 1 and 2, when Solomon says that we can, if we follow these keys, have a peaceful life. And so point number 1, he gives us the keys to a peaceful life, which a peaceful life is a good life. We'll talk about that in just a moment. Proverbs chapter 3, verse 1. My son, do not forget my teaching, but let your heart keep my commandments. For length of days and years of life and peace they will add to you. One of the keys to a good life is such that leads to a peaceful life. Now, Solomon again reminds his son of the blessing that is connected to listening to wisdom. And this is going to be a theme we return to every lesson, that God through Solomon and ourselves, we should understand that wisdom is valuable. God is telling us that. God is speaking through Solomon to tell you and I that wisdom is valuable. And of course, I think you've already seen that in Proverbs chapter 1 and Proverbs chapter 2. But again, Solomon reiterates it to his son. And remember, this is a letter from Solomon to his son. And when we speak to children, one of the best teachers is repetition. And so in this series of lessons, we're going to repeat this idea. Seek wisdom. Search after wisdom. Try to find wisdom. Avoid foolishness. Seek after to be wise. That's exactly what Solomon is repeating to his son. That's what he does here in verses 1 and 2. He says to him, I don't want you to forget my teaching. I don't want your heart to let go of the commandments that I give you. Rather, I want you to keep those in your heart. And he says the intended outcome is length of days, years of life, and peace that will be added to you. He says that we need to listen to the value of wisdom, but Solomon in verses 1 and 2 adds kind of a deeper dimension to the idea of listening to wisdom. He pulls out the idea that wisdom should not be forgotten. And the principles that lead us to wisdom aren't things that should be forgotten, but that we need to keep them in our heart. And that's what he says to his son. You know, I think you and I know this. There are so many passing fads in this world. Things that people do and they get used to and they enjoy them for a little while, and then after not much time, once everybody's jumped on board, the fad passes and it kind of drifts off into history and we move on to the next fad. And our world kind of works that way. It comes in waves and things become popular and fade into the distance. And the next thing becomes popular and fades into the distance. But Solomon tells us that wisdom, the commandments and teachings of wisdom, they're not passing fads that should be forgotten. Rather, wisdom is something that he, I believe, is indicating to us stands the test of time. Wisdom is always going to be relevant. Wisdom is always going to be useful. No matter where you live in history, wisdom is going to benefit you. And so he says, son, don't forget my commandments. Don't forget my teachings. But he says, I want you to put them and keep them in your heart. The word keep in verse 1 is a word that can mean to guard. He says, I want you to guard the things in your heart. Now, there are so many things that you and I guard in our heart, right? We guard memories that we hold so dear, things that we can think back on, and even though time has put a lot of distance between us and that memory may have become a little blurry, we still have that memory in our mind, and we hold dear to that. We guard it in our heart. All of us, we have talents that we guard in our hearts, things that we are good at and things that we do that have become integral to our lives. Some of us even guard in our hearts, probably all of us, I know I do, useless information. There is things that are just stuck in our hearts and we keep those and it's useless information, but we enjoy it. Solomon is getting to the point here that wisdom is something that we should guard with great diligence. We shouldn't let it slip away or be forgotten. Guarding the heart has a great effect on every area of my life. It's in Psalm 119 and verse 69 where David tells us that guarding my heart can protect those who want to smear my name, who are against me. Psalm 119 and verse 69. Proverbs chapter 4 and verse 23 tells me that we should guard our heart with all diligence because our heart is essential to life. From it flow the spring of life. You know, a hurt heart can cause problems in life. Solomon tells us we need to guard the things in our heart. We need to protect our heart. You know, there is a very clear result that Solomon brings out in verse 2, that if I remember the commandments of wisdom, if I keep the teachings that I'm learning, even us today as we listen to the book of Proverbs, if I keep these things in my heart, I guard them and keep them safe, I treasure them, I use wisdom. You remember let's see, it was Proverbs chapter 2 and verse 1, in fact, where Solomon told his son, treasure up my commandments with you. That is, fill yourself up with the things that I'm telling you. If we do that, he says that length of days and years of life and peace will be added to me. Now, this is very similar to a commandment that we have in the New Testament that was written by a man named Paul. Okay? Ephesians chapter 6, Paul writes in somewhat of a similar way. He's talking about parents and children, just as Solomon is writing to his son. It's a very similar situation. And Paul says in Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 1, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother. This is the first commandment with promise. Notice verse 3, that it may go well with you and that you may live long in the land. How do I know that life is going to go well with me and I'm going to live long in the land? Of course, that's a quotation back to Exodus chapter 20 and verse 12, where he tells them that if they honor their parents and obey them and keep that commandment, they'll live long in the land God is promising them. That is, there is a blessing to remembering the instruction I receive and living by it, treasuring it up within me. I believe all of us can understand that wisdom isn't going to make us have longer days. It says that in verse 3, chapter 3, verse 2, that it will add length of days to my life. We all know that wisdom isn't going to add more than 24 hours a day, but what it will do is it'll keep us from wasting our day, and in that sense it will lengthen our days. Wisdom keeps me from being lazy. Proverbs chapter 26 and verse 14, you remember that passage? It says that the sluggard turns on his bed like a door on its hinges. When I am not using wisdom, is a recipe for wasting my time. But when I use wisdom, I'm not going to waste my time. It will add length of days. I'll get more done in the day. I'll be more wise. I'll use my time more wisely. And that's, I think, a pretty practical application of verse 2. It gives me length of days. Not only that, he says, and years of life. Wisdom can add years to my life as well, because it keeps me from making, I can't think of another way to describe this, idiotic decisions. It keeps me from making dumb decisions and using my mind and wisdom. It keeps me from involving myself in the wrong things and putting myself in bad situations. It'll add years to my life. It'll also keep me from doing things that are harmful to myself. So here's the key. He says it will add length of days, years of life, and peace will be added to me. Here's the key. I will get more out of life by serving God than any other version of life that I live. I'll get more out of life serving God, using His wisdom, than any other version of life that I'm going to live. Living for the world, I'm not going to get as much out of life as I could if I served God. And eternity will be a lot different. So he says it'll add length of days, years of life, and then peace. It'll bring me peace. I don't know about you, but I like things to be at peace. That's kind of part of my personality. I like things to be peaceful with other people. I don't like to be in confrontation with others. That's not something that I feel I should constantly be doing. Now, I'm willing to do it when it's necessary, but it's not something I really enjoy. I enjoy peace. And he says listening to wisdom brings peace. Peace is something that you need in your life. You don't want drama to be a part of everyday life that you live, because if it is, you're not using wisdom. The New Testament speaks of peace in John chapter 14 and verse 27 when Jesus said, "Peace I leave with you." You remember, "My peace I give you," not as the world gives. Jesus said He was going to give us peace. Now, of course, it's not the world's idea of peace, but it is the true peace that comes with the certainty of my eternal destination and God's love for me. Romans chapter 14 and verse 19 says that we should pursue what makes for peace. God's people should be at peace. That's wisdom. You ever find somebody that's not always at peace? They're always tied up in something. There's always some kind of friction or drama or something going on in their life. I would posit to you they're not using wisdom. Wisdom, it adds length of days, years of life, and peace to you. So, wisdom is something, number one, that makes for a peaceful life. And I think all of us want a peaceful life. I hope you do. That's point number one. Point number two, he says that, number one, wisdom brings a key to the good life. That is the key of a peaceful life. Number 2, he says that wisdom brings the key of a respected life. Brings the key of a respected life. Now, how interesting is that? Some people, when they look at Proverbs chapter 3, verses 3 through 4, they say, wisdom brings popularity, or wisdom brings favor. And in many ways, I believe that's right. Wisdom is something that is a key to the good life because it leads to a respected life. That's the word I want to use for this point, is it leads to a respected life. Solomon encourages his son not to let steadfast love and faithfulness leave him. Listen to Proverbs 3 through 4. Let not steadfast love and faithfulness forsake you. Bind them around your neck. Write them on the tablet of your heart, so you will find favor and good success in the sight of God and man. He says, I don't want you to let steadfast love and faithfulness leave you. In fact, he says, if you take these qualities serious, verse 4 says that you'll find good favor and good success in life, not just with God, but also with man. There are many things that we should strive to maintain in life as Christians, but a good reputation among God and man is one of the most important. Don't you remember what Proverbs chapter 22 and verse 1 says when Solomon tells us that a good name is to be chosen rather than great riches, and favor is better than silver and gold? Proverbs 22 and verse 1. What about Jesus in Luke chapter 2 and verse 52 when the Bible says that he increased in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and man. Acts chapter 2 and verse 47 says, praising God and having favor with all the people. The early church had favor with all the people. Jesus increased in favor with God and man. 1 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 7 says that an elder, he must be well thought of by outsiders. There is very little in life that can be more valuable than a good, honest reputation. We should be careful to strive to have a good, honest reputation as often as we can. That's super important for us as Christians, and that's exactly what Solomon points out here in verses 3 and 4. We should want a good reputation. Now, how do I maintain this respected life? How do I have a respected name and a respected life like Solomon talks about in verse 4? He says in verse 3 this, that we should be people of steadfast love and faithfulness. Now that word steadfast love can mean kindness, mercy, love, and loyalty. So he says, as people, if you're going to use wisdom, that means that you're going to be kind to others, merciful to others. You're going to be loving and loyal to people. And then, of course, you have that word faithful, which also brings with it the idea of loyalty. So if you have steadfast love and faithfulness, he uses it in a negative sense in verse 3 where he says, don't let it forsake you. Now, that word forsake you basically just means to go away, to leave us, right? To abandon. These qualities that we have, if we don't let them go away, if we keep them, they influence every decision that we make. You don't think kindness and love and loyalty and faithfulness, all that determines the decisions you make? How about the way that you treat people when you speak to them? How about the way you treat others when something bad happens to you? Do you want to get back at them? Do you want them to repay you for every problem they've caused you? Do you always want to be the one that turns out best? Or do you want to do things for others? Do you want to be selfless instead of selfish? And that applies to not just Christians amongst Christians, that applies to Christians amongst the world. How do we treat other people? It also teaches me that the way I treat other people has a great effect on my personal reputation. Now, what kind of reputation do you have? The thing about a reputation is it takes a long time to build up and a second to destroy. We need to be careful with our reputation in life. This is, of course, in verse 3, set in contrast to those who would not be this way, right? So instead of having steadfast love and faithfulness or having kindness and faithfulness, Solomon puts the opposite with that. It should come to mind of the fool who is not kind, but he's selfish, who's not faithful, but he's unfaithful, he's ungodly. We don't want to be those people. And let me tell you this, if you're that kind of person, if you are not kind in everything you do, if you are not loyal in the things that you do, if you are not merciful and loving and faithful, these qualities can be very detrimental to you if you don't have them. I promise you this, I don't care who you spend your time around. I don't care how evil they are. I don't care how many denominational people you meet that you think are just straight from the devil. I don't care how many people that we have bad opinions about. You see, I've met people that have all that kind of stuff, and I've been guilty of those things too. I think, all the people in other religions, man, they're just infidels, and they're so terrible, and man, they're just bound straight for hell, and good riddance. They should be. I'm not even going to waste my time on them. I've met people who've said things like that, and you want to know where that gets you? Nowhere. It doesn't get us anywhere to act like that, to treat people like they're less than people. In fact, Proverbs chapter 3, verses 3 and 4 is a father's advice to a son, a man who is very successful telling his son, hey, listen, you need to be kind. You need to be steadfast in your love. You need to be faithful and loyal to people, because if you don't, bad things are coming around the corner. I don't care who you know or who you spend time with or how evil they are. Deep down, every person in this world respects kindness and faithfulness. Now, they may treat you differently outwardly. They may act like you're all crazy outward because you're kind, and they may try to run over you and take advantage of you, but that doesn't really matter. If people take advantage of you, if they take money when they weren't supposed to from you, or if they do something against you, the Bible doesn't tell us to retaliate against them. It tells us to be kind, to turn the other cheek. If somebody needs one thing, let me give a bunch of things to them. Right? The Bible doesn't tell us to want to get back everything that people have unfairly taken from us. The Bible never teaches us that. What it teaches us to be is kind, merciful, compassionate. I promise you, the church in this area, no matter where you are in this West Georgia area, if you're anything less than kind, merciful, and loving, the church is never going to grow. That's the principle that I believe Solomon teaches in Proverbs chapter 3, verses 3 and 4. He said, listen, if you want to find favor among men and God, how do we think the people in Acts chapter 2 and verse 47, how do we think they found favor with God and man? How do we think the people in Acts chapter 2 found favor? How do we think Jesus found favor with God and man? It's because He was faithful and He was kind. He was compassionate. He was loving. He was loyal. That was Jesus' example. An elder needs to be that as well. We have great elders, and you want to know what? I've been super impressed, and I'm going to brag on them for just a moment. There have been times, one particular time that just sticks out in my mind. I knocked on a lady's door while I was out door knocking, and I told her I was with the Bowden Church of Christ, and she said, oh, so-and-so goes there. I said, yes, ma'am, he's one of our elders. And she said, he is just the kindest and the most helpful person I have ever met. You want to know what that is? That's 1 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 7. They have a good reputation among outsiders. If everyone outside the church thinks bad of the people in the church, then we've missed the example of Jesus and the church. Because it says Jesus found favor with man. It says the church found favor with people. And it says that elders are to have favor with people. In fact, Proverbs 22 and verse 1 says we need to have a good reputation. And if we don't have that in the community, the church is never going to grow. If people in the community don't think that we're loving and kind, if they think that we're hateful in the way we approach them, then we're never going to follow the example of Jesus. Now, that doesn't mean that we sacrifice the truth. We always speak the truth in love, but I promise you, the saying is true. And I guarantee you know this to be true. Whether it's in your workplace or it's in your friendships or your marriage or your home, it's not about what you say. You can probably finish this. It's about how you say it, right? And so we need to be careful that we use steadfast love and faithfulness, that we bind them around our neck, write them as tablets on our heart. And he said, if that's the case, then you're going to find favor with God and man. Okay? If we follow the example of the early church, of Jesus, and of Paul's discourse on leadership, we will have stronger friendships, marriages, business successes. We'll even be better parents if we implement this. Spend a little bit more time on point 1 or point 2 than I had notes for, but I hope you see where I'm coming from. The reputation thing is something I've learned the hard way in my life, and I'm sure you've had to learn that lesson the hard way once or twice as well. When you've made a mistake and it has tarnished your reputation with one person, I hate that we have to experience those things, but it teaches us how important our reputation is. So that's point number 2. Keys to living a good life is that I'm going to live a respected life. Proverbs 3 and 4. Okay, let's move on to point number 3. Keys to living a good life. Solomon gives us in verses 5 and 6 the keys to living a successful life. Part of a good life is that it's successful. Now, we've studied Proverbs 3, 5, and 6, and these are probably verses that you're familiar with. These are very popular verses from the book of Proverbs, so we're not going to spend a lot of time. I did a sermon just on these two verses not long ago, but I do want to mention a few things about Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. He says that we can live a successful life, which can be a good life, right? Trust in the Lord with all your heart and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge Him, and He will make straight your paths. Proverbs chapter 3, verses 5 and 6. Another key to a good life, Proverbs 3, 5, and 6, is that which leads to a successful life. Solomon encourages his son to consider God and His plans and not to trust his own opinion above everything else. And I think all of us could probably learn that lesson better each day. You know, the decision-making process can be super complicated. When we're trying to decide on one thing or another, whether it's a small thing or it's a very important thing. When you decide on your career path, there's a lot of factors that go into that decision. When you are trying to decide who you're going to marry, or you're going to decide how you're going to prepare for retirement, or you're going to decide what refrigerator you want to buy. You know, there's all kinds of decisions, and we take in a lot of information. There's a lot of information out there that can educate us in making the right decision. Okay? When we do that, we look to so many sources, but I think I've been guilty of this, just as you probably have. Sometimes we forget to look to the one source that truly matters, and that's to God. The word straight in Proverbs chapter 3, verse 6, is, when he says, in all your ways acknowledge Him and He will make straight your paths. Some translations say He will direct your paths. That's a word that basically means to smooth out. You know, when we trust in the guidance of God, we will never go wrong. Using wisdom and making decisions based on that wisdom is always going to help us. Notice that Solomon doesn't just say to trust God. He doesn't leave it at that. He modifies it by saying, trust God with all your heart. We can be tempted to only give trust to God over those things which are not extremely important to us or things that we're not super passionate about. That's Proverbs 3 and verse 5, because it tells us that we need to not just give God the things, trust Him in the things that we're not passionate about, but trust Him with all of our heart. Everything about our life should be handed over to God. Now, we as humans, we normally love control, but wisdom teaches us that we need to relinquish that control. And so we need to trust in the Lord with all our heart and do not lean on our own understanding. Very easy for us to lean on our own understanding because that's how we frame the worldview that we have. We frame the way we see people, our marriages, sin, even the way the world works. We frame all of that by our experiences. The problem with our experiences, even though they may seem real to us, it may not represent the reality of the world God created. And so I don't need to always just lean on my understanding of things. I need to lean on God's understanding above anything else. So he says, trust in the Lord with all your heart. In verse 6 he says, in all your ways acknowledging Him. Again, that all-inclusive statement that in everything I do, I'm going to acknowledge God above all else. It may be relevant for me to say that our paths can be straightened or can be made directed or can be smoothed out. That part of verse 6, He will make straight your paths. I find it important to point out that our paths can be straightened in two ways. Okay, the first one, when we hand over the reins to God, God can take the crooked mess that we may have made of our life, and He can take that crookedness and make it straight for His glory. Okay, so that's one way God straightens our paths. He takes what we have and He brings it into His glory so that people see the things that we can do and they give glory to God in heaven, Matthew chapter 5. However, there's another way that God straightens my paths in that when I hand the reins over to God, I begin to walk God's way. And in that way, my paths become straight. Because I stop living for myself, I start living for the Lord, and the Lord's ways are always righteous. So I'm walking on the straight path of God. So those are the two ways God can straighten our paths. Okay, that's point number 3, that we can have the good life by having a successful life if we hand over the reign of our life and the direction of it, and ultimately who gets the glory in it to God. All right, point number 4. Another key to the good life is the key Solomon gives us for a healthy life. Proverbs chapter 3, verses 7 and 8. One of these keys leads to such a life that is healthy, and Solomon encourages his son to keep his pride in check. Okay, pride is an unhealthy thing. To keep his pride in check, and then his actions will follow. Notice what it says in Proverbs 3, 7 and 8. Be not wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord, turn away from evil. It will be healing to your flesh and refreshment to your bones. Notice the healthy language that's used there. The result of me keeping my pride in check and living the life God has desired for me to live, the result of that is that I will have healing and refreshment in my life. We'll talk about that in just a moment. Solomon begins by telling his son not to be wise in his own eyes. Now that word wise in Proverbs chapter 3 and verse 7, be not wise, it can also mean arrogant. And I think probably all of us can make that connection in our mind that when we're wise in our own eyes, arrogance is just around the corner. In essence, Solomon is telling his son that being a know-it-all individualist is not good for you. Working always on your path, which steps back to verse 5 where he says, do not lean on your own understanding. He kind of modifies that in verse 7 by saying, don't be wise in your own eyes. That is, don't take your opinion to be the most important one. The person who's the know-it-all individualist, he's not doing himself any favors. Listen to Proverbs 26 and verse 16. It's talking about a lazy person, but it's speaking of the arrogance that comes with being wise in your own eyes. The sluggard in Proverbs 26 and verse 16, it says, is wiser in his own eyes than 7 men who can answer sensibly. We don't need to have the arrogance that Solomon speaks about in verses 7 and 8. Instead of being arrogant, being a know-it-all, or being wise in our own eyes, Solomon says that we need to fear the Lord, as we've already talked about, and this whole book is really centered around fearing God. To fear the Lord is to live in respect of the reality of His existence. God exists. God's going to judge me one day. God is both a compassionate, but He's also a very just God. So the things that I do in relation to His commandments are going to matter. He's going to bring all of that into judgment. I'm going to live in the reality that that's true because it is. When I know those facts, it's going to make me operate my life way differently. That's living in the fear of the Lord. And he also says in verse 7 to turn away from evil. To turn away from evil, that word turn away can also be translated avoid, which makes sense. We need to not only live in the reality of God's existence, but we need to walk away from evil as often as we can. Now the result is stunning in verse 8. He says that when I stop trusting my own opinions and I rely on the opinion of God above anything else, when I live in the reality of God's existence, I fear the Lord, I turn the reins over to Him. When I do that, it says that spiritual healing is right around the corner. Spiritual healing is promised to those who turn to God in obedience. And sin is the sickness that Jesus came to overcome. And He took it out of the way. And so that healing is, I believe, a spiritual healing in Proverbs chapter 3, verses 7 and 8. Now, it brings a lot of interest to me that throughout the book of Proverbs, the subject of bones are really important. Now, we're going to get to that later in our study. We're going to do a topical study through the book of Proverbs of bones because it's mentioned a lot through there. But I do want to say, just at this moment in this verse, that we want our bones to be refreshed and not to be rotten. The book of Proverbs says that bones can be rotted by a lot of things. By bad companionship, it can be rotted by toxic family relationships. It can be rotted even by envy, when I envy somebody else. And so I need to be careful not to let my bones rotten, but rather to pursue those things that refresh my bones, that almost strengthen them and make them more pliable and usable. Okay, so that's point number 4. Point number 5 in Proverbs chapter 3, to living a good life. We only have 2 left. Point number 5 is this. To live a good life, Solomon gives us keys to live a prosperous life. To live a prosperous life. Now, another key to this good life is such that leads to the prosperous life. We're not talking about any kind of prosperity gospel here. What we're saying is that God has set certain principles in place that will prosper us if we obey them. Solomon encourages his son to remember to give God what is best and to give God the first of what he harvests and what comes about in his life. In essence, that we're going to sow and then we're going to reap what we sow. And that's a principle from Galatians chapter 6 we'll talk about in just a moment. Not only that, he says that we'll reap much more than we've sown, which is a principle in Scripture. So he says in Proverbs chapter 3, verses 9 and 10 this, "Honor the Lord with your wealth, and with the first fruits of all your produce. Then your barns will be filled with plenty, and your vats will be bursting with wine." What wisdom teaches me is that I should honor God first and foremost with the things that I am blessed with my wealth and the things that are a blessing from God. He uses the word honor in verse 9, and the word honor the Lord basically means to value somebody. When I honor them, I'm valuing them. Remember, we have like honorary meetings and honorary ceremonies where we honor someone. That is, we value them or we esteem them for the things they've done. He says that we need to honor, value, or esteem God for the things He's done. He says honor Him with something. What are we going to honor the Lord with? He says we need to honor Him with our wealth and with the first fruits of our produce. If we all had the attitude of esteeming God first, of giving Him the best of what we have at all times, we would have a lot less problems in this world. We would have a lot less selfishness. But nonetheless, we do have this problem. We oftentimes will honor ourselves first instead of God, which is sad. An important principle to remember in the Bible is that we display our reliability over what we can manage and how God can trust us based on taking care of what we already have. It's in Luke chapter 16 and verse 10 that says, "One who is faithful in little will be faithful in much, and one who is dishonest in little is also dishonest in much." And that is how I prove my worthiness to God, that I can manage the things He's given me. I am faithful over just a little, and if I'm faithful over just a little, that means I can be faithful over much. But if I'm careless with the little that I have and I don't take good care of it and I'm wasteful, how can anyone, including God, trust me to be faithful over a lot of things? It just doesn't work that way. Proverbs chapter 3 tells me that I need to give the first things to God, and if I do, there's a reciprocal blessing that comes from Him. There is something that is paid back to me if I honor God first. And the principle Solomon promotes here is that I give God out of my blessings first. Before anything else, God receives my generosity, and as a result, God then honors me in return. The principle is taught clearly in the New Testament when Paul tells us that we reap what we sow in Galatians chapter 6. And remember, what you reap is always more than you sow. It's always later and greater. Remember that phrase. When we sow, we reap later and greater. So you plant a corn seed in the ground. I planted some at my home. Many of you may have already done so. And my corn is about that tall. Right? I plant that little bitty corn, and it's already sowing a lot more than I planted. There's a lot more coming out of the ground than I put in there. And when that corn grows up, it's going to put ears on, maybe 1, 2, 3 ears on. And I'm going to pick those ears, and the number of kernels I'm going to have on those ears of corn is going to be way more than what I planted. Why? Because what I reap comes later and greater than what I've sown. That's the way God works. He placed that into existence at the beginning of time, that things would produce after their kind and that they would produce more than the seed that went into the ground. And that's exactly how the world works. He says, if you give of God, of your wealth and your first fruits, you give God generously, you honor Him, you esteem Him as someone who deserves the first of what you have, what's going to happen? Your barns will be filled with, notice the word, plenty, and your vats will be, notice, they will be bursting with wine. Two words that indicate to us the seriousness of God's tremendous outpouring back to us. Listen, you and I can never outgive God. And so if I want to have a good life, it means a life of generosity that leads to prosperity. That's God's blessing. It's not some prosperity gospel. It says that if I give to God, God gives to me in return. That's the way that the system works. And it's a beautiful principle in the Bible. Key number 6, the last one. The key to a good life is learning to live a disciplined life, or a life of understanding discipline. We all know that discipline is never pleasant when it's administered. We all get that sick feeling when we're guilty of doing something wrong. Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 11, the Hebrew writer says, "For the moment, all discipline seems painful rather than pleasant." And we've all been there. I remember getting whoopings when I was a little boy, and it was not pleasant, I promise you. But later, it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. Discipline isn't pleasant, but it trains us into who we need to be. Whether that's exercising discipline over our actions, exercising discipline over our impulses, exercising discipline over our current bodies, anything that requires discipline, it's not pleasant when you do it, but the benefits often come pretty quickly. If you begin to eat healthy, eating healthy is really not that pleasant. Exercising, it seems good because you know how you're going to feel afterwards, but it's kind of fun to sit on the couch and eat potato chips, right? But the blessing of that exercise, it comes after. It peacefully trains us into who we need to be. Solomon tells his son not to be weary of the discipline of the Lord. Listen to what it says. Proverbs 3, verses 11 and 12. My son, do not despise the Lord's discipline, nor be weary of His reproof. For the Lord reproves him who He loves, as a father the son in whom He delights. The discipline of God. Now He says, I don't want you to despise the Lord's discipline, nor to be weary of His reproof. Now the word weary basically just means to be leery of it. That is, when that discipline comes and you experience it, it builds up within you a loathing that ultimately leads to repulsion. Solomon says, I don't want you to follow that path. Don't be leery of discipline where you are disgusted by it and it builds up a repulsion to the one who's disciplined you. He said, don't have that attitude. Why? Because in verse 12, the Lord reproves whom He loves. Discipline is an act of love. Church discipline is an act of love. The discipline that we get would be the result of us not doing what God says, and that's what the result here is. Solomon's saying, listen, if you don't follow these commands, like we said in verse 1, don't forget my teaching, don't forsake my commands. He says, if you don't follow those, discipline is right around the corner. He's telling him to remember that guidance comes from someone who loves him and wants to see him succeed. If you and I want to live a good life, we need to understand discipline. We need to understand it has a purpose. It has a reward to it as well. Any discipline from God is an indication that He's not forgetting us, but He's taking us very seriously, and He wants to see us succeed. He loves us. And that's exactly what He pulls out at the end. The Lord reproves whom He loves, as a father the son in whom He delights. Keys to a good life. You know, we can have a good life. The Bible tells us that it's possible. That doesn't mean that everything will be sunshine and rainbows, but it does mean that my life can be glorifying to God and productive to that end. I can have a peaceful life, a respected life. I can have a successful life, a healthy life, a prosperous life, and then I can have a life that understands discipline. What a blessing wisdom is to us in Proverbs chapter 3, that all of these blessings could be ours if we were to learn wisdom and follow after the Lord's instruction. Let's end with a word of prayer. Our Father above, we thank You for this time to study Your Word. We appreciate Proverbs chapter 3, Lord. Thank You so much for the inspiration of that passage that teaches us this about the life that we can live. Help us to follow these principles just as Solomon told his son to. And thank You so much for Jesus, through whom everything that we do today is possible. And Lord, please be with us. Help us as we return to services next week. Be with us and keep us safe. It's through Your Son's name we pray. Amen.